All right.
All
Well,
right,
welcome everybody.
welcome. All right, thank you so much for joining us, everyone. Paul and I are stepping in for some colleagues of ours. So I just wanted to introduce myself. My name is Adrienne Billis. I am the project coordinator for the Lilly Endowment Initiative here at the Episcopal Church Foundation. I am a woman who wears many hats. So today I will be hosting this webinar. And just to kind of introduce you a little bit to ECF, just in case we are new to you, we are an independent, lay-led organization that helps congregations, dioceses, and other Episcopal communities of faith to engage in visioning, planning, developing leadership, and raise and manage resources for ministry. And this is actually a pretty special webinar because this is part of our Lilly Endowment Initiative. We have a series of these webinars designed very much to help clergy and lay leaders together address the economic challenges of congregational ministry in the 21st century. So this is part of our larger 3-year grant that we have received from the Lilly Endowment Initiative. And just a few things before I kind of introduce our host. We will be using the chat box for questions, and Paul Stevens has given me permission to interrupt. So please do feel free to put those questions in there, and I will politely interrupt, and so that we can keep the conversation going. So please feel free to use that, and I will make sure that I'm checking that and passing off those questions and continuing that dialogue. And as I said before, this webinar is being recorded. We will be posting it up on our website, ecfvp.com, as well as the PowerPoints. And as always, right, if questions come up during, wonderful. If this ends and something kind of just hits you, please feel free to reach out. We can do our best to get those questions answered. So if it's kind of something that comes up in a couple of days, please feel free to reach out. We are always here to help. So without further ado, today's webinar is called Extending Ministry Footprint Through Building Use. So we actually have, we're going to have Steve Follis from the Church Insurance Agency Corporation lead this, but actually he, like so many of the people working with the Church Insurance Agency, had to be called out to California. So his colleague, Paul Stevens, has graciously stepped in to help lead this webinar. Paul is the VP of Marketing and Risk Management Services with the Church Insurance Agency. And I have to be very careful. I told Paul before, I have to be careful with my acronyms. I cannot use the CIA because then we might confuse it with secret agents and that lot. But the Church Insurance Agency serves 95% of the Episcopal churches in the US, protecting people and property.
Great.
All right, so Paul, if I can pass it off to you and get us started, and we will get going.
Sounds great. Thank you so much, and welcome everyone. I'm glad to be here today to talk to you about a topic that comes up in our line of work quite a bit as time goes on, and it's the concept of other uses for church property. And we'll go ahead and get into this. And like we said, any questions you have, ask them when you're thinking of them. I'm very informal. I want this to be interactive. So we'll get started. So the first question we might ask ourselves is, why are churches expanding their building usage? Comes down to a couple things that are hand in hand. It's revenues, declining revenues or pledges, and increased operating costs. So when you look at it from a church perspective, one of the biggest assets they have are buildings. And a lot of times maybe the building was built for a certain purpose decades ago and now is not used to that same extent. So they have free space. So they're always looking for ways to use those buildings and to sometimes looking to offset the loss of revenue or decline pledging, things like that. So that's the concept that we're going to talk about today. So let's get into it. So when typical for me, what'll be is I'll get a call from a church and they'll say, "Hey, Paul, we're looking for ways to raise revenue, and we've brainstormed, and there's some needs in our community that are such, and we're thinking about, could we fit into this, and could it help us and help the community at the same time?" Some of the examples that we see all the time are thrift stores, sports teams. Now, some of these are designed to generate revenue directly. Some are designed really to generate ministry, meaning bring people into the church, which will ultimately lead to pledging and things like that. Sports clubs would be an example of the latter. So they might say, "Hey, if we did a softball program or a soccer program, we'd get more kids, and maybe we could, have an impact positive on our average Sunday attendance." Community classes, this is typically, again, you get into daycares, preschools, things like that. Community farming, I've seen that. I'm in Tennessee, and there's actually a movie that Sony made called All Saints, which is about Episcopal Church in Smyrna, Tennessee, that started a community farm. And I think I may have been the only one who saw it at the theater, but it's a good movie. And a good story. And it was an example of an extension ministry that was way outside the box, but really helped serve that community and really helped to sustain that church. So shelters, we see that type of thing too, soup kitchens. But really, I've heard people call with the questions about dog parks, all kinds of different ideas. So the idea here is to wrap our heads around is there's lots of ways to maybe generate interest in the church, lead to revenue, pledging with the church through extension ministries. These are just a handful of them. Now, things we need to consider. So the Mother Goose LLC daycare has shown an interest in using our educational wing, which we don't use anymore. And it's going to generate some revenue for us, the church, and it's going to help them serve the community with their daycare. What do we need to look at before we get into a situation like that? That's just an example. But you really you got to go down and check a lot of different things. The first thing you want to see is this partner, so to speak, are they insured? And if so, are they adequately insured? When you get into these negotiations, you will typically have folks that are trying to get you to take on their risk and vice versa. It's something that happens in between these agreements generally. So a couple things to avoid would be hold harmless agreements. Try to avoid those. You want to be able to stand on your own. Your coverage covers you. Their coverage covers them. You start waiving putting hold harmless or waiving subrogation, you start to impact your coverage, and you don't want to do that. And then a couple things toward the end that all result in seeking some legal advice. You want to make sure that you understand any tax consequences depending on the use that you get into, and you want to make sure that you avoid jeopardizing nonprofit status. So again, that all leads you, when you're getting into signing legal agreements, it's really a good idea to have some legal expertise, review those documents before you ever sign off on them. So that's just the highlights of things you would want to consider. Let's move on. Then this leads to that typical, how do we balance this risk with what the, so to speak, reward will be for taking on this risk? So the first thing I always talk to vestries about is they have to understand that with more activity comes a greater risk. And our vestry might say, okay, what does that mean to us? What it ultimately means is that potentially it could drive insurance costs. So for example, if you go into a situation where you've signed a deal that creates a greater exposure for the church than just being a church, underwriters are typically going to charge for that exposure. Now, a lot of this is pushed to the tenant, so to speak, because generally you're going to require them to have their own coverage, which is going to make the charge for you a little less. But you're still going to have some incidental charges for liability risk being a little greater. It's important that we assess the risk with a property walkthrough. What does that mean? So church insurance, denominational carrier, one of the things we do every day somewhere in this country is walk through a facility and prepare a loss assessment, risk management report with some recommendations. This is important to do from time to time. If you're insured with church insurance and you're not aware of this program, reach out to us. We'll have our regional rep get in touch with you. They can pull your file, let you know the last time there was a walkthrough, share a copy of that, and if it needs to be updated, they can certainly come back out and do it again. This is always important to do when you're getting into new situations. You want to make sure you understand what you have at risk in the property, things that you might want to address before you ever get into a deal. You want to make sure you have the right limits of liability. Now, if you're with us, a lot of this is kind of prescribed in how we write the coverage. So very high limits of liability. So basically, if you're with us, you just want to let us know what the idea is, what the risk is. We can come back to you and say, hey, here's probably a good idea, or have you thought about this, or it may cost this. We can provide that kind of expertise.
Mhm.
Review coverage. Is there a question?
Nope, not yet.
Okay. Review coverage for both the church and the sponsored activities, as well as the operations on your property that you do not control. So again, if you get into a tenant situation where you're leasing a building or part of a building, you have your risk that's under your control, but because you've leased that building, you may not have the same access to that property that you would normally have. Not that you waive your access, but it's usually a little, more cordial where, you're not just barging in on them, so to speak. So you want to make sure that you understand your operation and their operation, and that you're constantly up to date as things change with those operations. And at the end of it, it talks about a safer place to worship means a reduction in claims. What does that matter to a vestry? Again, it gets back and relates to insurance premiums. So obviously, if you have a good risk management program, you've set up a good situation with a tenant or another opportunity, managed all that risk, and the result is you have really good luck and no claims of increases that you would otherwise see if you created a situation where you had a high frequency of claims all of a sudden. Okay. And next. Outside groups tip sheet. We're going to get into some stuff in the next couple slides where we'll talk about some tips that we have about this. There's also some collateral that you can download from our website. We'll show you that in a little bit here. Outside groups tip sheet. Groups leasing space from the church should have the church named as initial insured on their policy. What does that mean? All right, so let's go back to our hypothetical. The Mother Goose LLC and St. Swithin's agree. Mother Goose is going to become a tenant and use one of the buildings. Mother Goose has shown that they have insurance at the right levels of insurance. This next step just solidifies it, where Mother Goose goes to their insurance carrier and says, name St. Swithin's as an additional insured on their policy. So what that does is it gives St. Swithin's the chance to control the claim. So if a lawsuit comes against Mother Goose LLC, St. Swithin's will be in the loop with regard to the whole thing. Also of importance is if Mother Goose lapses their policy for any reason, is canceled, non-payment, St. Swithin's will be notified. So this is a very important piece and a best practice. There should be an agreement as to who is responsible for the maintenance and housekeeping of the space. Now, you never want to give that away completely because, 5 years later, you open the door and it's not the building you remember. So you want to stay on top of this and spell it out. And I think you want to have some checks and balances. If the agreement says that tenant will be responsible, then St. Swithin's wants to make sure to hold them up to that. So some sort of schedule where once a year we walk through, whatever that may be, whatever makes sense.
Paul, can I ask a question?
Sure.
Does the church insurance agency help with these kind of negotiations? And no? Okay.
No, so we're not attorneys by trade. We're risk management folks. Generally, we're going to refer you back to either either your attorney or to the attorney at the Diocese of Chancellor.
Okay.
But yeah, we have to be very careful that we don't hold ourselves out as legal experts
Sure.
because we're not. But good question.
Mhm.
We get a lot of questions like that. A lot of times the answer is you need to talk to the Chancellor, and that's usually the best and safest way to go about it too.
Wonderful. Thank you.
No problem. Be sure the group using your property understands any applicable restrictions or hazards. So this is going to get into anything that's unique about the property. For example, we have a fish pond on the property and we have the daycare wanting to rent space. We want to make sure they're aware of it. Anything that's hazardous, anything that's unusual, just want to point it out. Any restrictions you may have, such as can't use the kitchen or no smoking, whatever it might be, you just want to make it clear. And then the last one, we've kind of said this before, it's complete a safety checklist before you turn over control of the property. This just goes back to some of the other points of walking through the property, agreeing to who's responsible, and having a mechanism to double check that everybody's living up to the spirit of whatever the agreement may be. All right, moving right along. Host liquor liability. We get a lot of questions about this. They generally go like, we've got an idea, we're going to have a fundraiser, we're going to have wine and beer and food. Is that okay? Are we covered? That's usually the first question. And then that leads me to either solicited or unsolicited risk management advice about how to do this in a safe way. So the answer is the policy does cover this incidental liquor liability called host liquor liability. With church insurance, if you're with us, you have coverage for that up to $1 million in your base policy and at least $1 million in your umbrella, depending on what size umbrella you have in place with us. Now, that covers the church. The best practice would be when an outside party is using your premises, such as a wedding. Now, this isn't always the case. It's really up to the church. But if for example, the wedding says, yeah, we're going to rent the parish hall, and the church says, great, and the wedding is going to have a bartender, they hire a bartender or a vendor, it's perfectly appropriate for the church to require a certificate of insurance from that vendor. So it's the similar dance. It's just like, show us that you're a legitimate company, vendor, that you've got insurance, and so it's just a similar approach. Check your licensing requirements based on your locale. Determine if you need a liquor license. Most of the time you won't, but that can change depending on the municipality, the state, things like that. So you'll want to check into that. The best advice I can give you as a risk manager for Episcopal Church about host liquor is outsource the bartending. Have it part of the requirement, whether it's the church sponsoring the activity or an outside group coming in. The best practice would be require a professional bartender. There's a couple reasons for that. The first is they are trained at how not to overserve people. They're also trained at how to, appropriately ask for ID if that's ever a situation we have to address. I think more with weddings, maybe back in the day when people got married when they're 18, you would have had a different approach to these type of events. Again, asking for a certificate of insurance. The thing about a professional bartender too, the main thing is the overserving. They're trained not to do it. They're trained to spot it. The other tip I would give you about host liquor is you always want to make alternatives just as attractive. So soda, water, and food's a very important piece of this. So again, there's a safe way to do this, to have a glass of wine and some fellowship. But what we want to avoid is anyone getting overserved, because guess what? If they go out and leave that event and cause pain and suffering, that's all going to come home. Obviously, the human cost is extraordinary, and then there's a legal cost that's going to come home to roost with the church, which would negate the whole purpose of why you're trying to outsource, improve this ministry, create revenue, things like that. So things to keep in mind.
Paul, we just have a comment that I wanted to bring into the conversation here. Scott just posted, and part of Scott, I just wanted to read this. So building code issues may also come into play for extending the use of a facility. With many church buildings being older or historic, features may be non-compliant. Going about your church business, you may be grandfathered, but if you invite outside users in, that may trigger required upgrades.
Yes,
So
Scott's correct. We see
yeah,
that a lot with preschools, any kind of school. All of a sudden, you know, the tenant is accredited, for example, and now the state's in there, and the state's like, where's the smoke detectors?
sure.
Where's the sprinklers? Scott's exactly correct. These are all things, when you're looking at these opportunities, you have to weigh all of that, because there's cost associated, there's opportunity cost, and you have to pick the right balance. That's a good point. All right.
Yeah, Paul, can I just ask another question? So
Sure.
you know, this is just an interesting conversation, but we were talking about church canons and serving liquor. So would you suggest that the bartender or the company providing the bartender be aware of kind of church canons? So providing non-alcoholic beverages, some of the ideas about providing alcohol when youth are present. Is that
Yeah.
a necessity? Maybe not a necessity, but a thought to consider. Oh, I think Paul might have just frozen there. All right, everyone, hold on 1 second while I get Paul back. Paul, if you can hear us, you're just frozen on the screen here. Let's see. All right, everyone, give us a few seconds. I think we just lost. Oh, here we go. Paul is coming back.
I'm
Welcome
back.
back.
All right. Now, do you see everything on the screen still?
I see you. I don't see the PowerPoints.
See this? How about now?
There we are, and we're back.
All right. I don't know what happened there. Sorry about that.
No
Did we
problem.
lose everyone, or are they back?
No, we're all still here.
Okay. All right. So we'll move forward here.
Sure.
All right. Why isn't that working? Okay. So getting toward the end here, just wanted to point you to some resources that are out there at churchinsurance.org. There is a safety and insurance handbook for churches. I think it's a good idea for y'all to take a look at it, download it. It's a PDF. It's a little over 100 pages long. What I like about it is it has a lot of information in it, and it's easy to use. It has a searchable index. So someone calls you up and says, host liquor liability, what's the deal with that? You can go to the index, click on host liquor. It'll take you to that spot in the document. So it's out there, it's free. Download it, share it. It's good information. We also have a bunch of different risk management type brochures, posters, tip sheets, checklists. This isn't just about the topic we've discussed today. It's a broader range of all things church risk management. And then the last thing is a plug. If you're not already a subscriber, I think we have about 50,000 subscribers to our online electronic risk management newsletter. It's called The Good Steward. If you're not on that and you want to send an email through to us, we can get you on that list. And it comes out every couple months, and it's just good information, risk management type of tips about all things Episcopalian. So,
And actually, Scott has just another comment that I wanted to bring in. Thank you again, Scott. He says, regarding church practices or canons, the parish has to think through its priorities or norms. And thank you, Scott. I really like that, beyond kind of insurance, but actually, who are we? What are we trying to do? And articulate that those norms to users. I think it's a really important balance. And as Scott says, it can be quite tricky.
Yes.
Yes, indeed.
Yep. That's true. All right. So Q&A, just open it up for any additional questions that folks may have that we didn't hear from, or what do we have?
We just have some comments from Scott, but if there are anyone who would like to type in their questions into the chat box, that would be on the bottom of your screen there. Oh, yes, we do have a question. Thank you.
Okay.
We have, can you talk about safe church requirements for outside groups?
Sure. All right. So I'm going to have to, this is going to be a somewhat long-winded answer, but I think it'll be helpful. So the guidelines for safe church, when it was first implemented in 2003, those guidelines were set by church insurance. In 2015 at General Convention, a resolution went through to look into updating those model policies. Those model policies were ultimately updated in 2018, but is no longer from church insurance, it's from the national church. So there's some links on our page that'll get you to their model policies. Long-winded way of saying we're no longer the expert on the model policies, can't really speak to it. We still support the program. We still fund the materials, the videos and all that. And so where we are, this is just a good time to talk about it. So we've got the new model policies, national church is managing and implementing. You would have to direct your questions to them. They are also working in a committee to update all of the materials, so the videos, all that stuff. We don't have any information as to what the ETA is. I suspect the ETA is 2021 General Convention. So at this point, we don't control the model policies, but we still fund the existing program and the videos that are available. At such time as the National Church has the new materials, I'm sure you'll be notified, and we'll transition that ownership over to them as well. I hope that helps.
Sure. Would you mind just for a second defining what does safe church mean for those who might?
Yep. So safe church is a general term that people use about how to protect against misconduct, things like that, sexual misconduct. It started with Safeguarding God's Children was the original brand of that. Safe church is a broader topic, includes more than just the children piece, elder abuse, adult on adult. It's very broad. So that when people say safe church, they're generally talking about that.
Okay, thank you very much. And we have a question from Edie. If you have church members using snow blowers on public sidewalks, does church liability cover them?
It's a pub, so it's not the church's. All right, so this is gray, and what this would come down to is this person acting on behalf of the church? So for example, if the church has said, go clean the sidewalk, bring your snowblower and do that, then the argument could be made this is a church-sponsored activity. Now, being that it's a public sidewalk, I would imagine you'd have attorneys pointing the finger at each other as to whose risk it really was. So it's a bit of a gray area.
Absolutely. Scott just has wondering any comments on bringing the community into the use of the church facility as a bridge to the funding. He's talking about kind of the separation of church and state, where there is a risk of jeopardizing nonprofit status. Wow, that is a really complex question. Thank you, Scott, for that.
Yep. And that was one of the bullet points in one of the slides. That's one of the things you really got to keep your eye on the ball with that and get a lawyer involved with those kind of things. You want to make sure the worst thing you could do is jeopardize that.
Yes,
right.
Absolutely. Our next question from Blair. How much insurance coverage is available to churches and the church members, including clergy, if there is a safe church accusation? And
Accusation. Okay. So if you're insured with church insurance, you have $1 million per occurrence sexual misconduct limit with a $2 million annual aggregate. What that means is you could have two $1 million claims in one given year and not exhaust that limit. Then beyond that, anyone who's in our program automatically has an umbrella that provides an additional $1 million. So for an occurrence, you would have $2 million, okay? Now, the way these claims go when we see them is we insure the church and the diocese. We will get claimed on both. And the diocese will have the same limits as the church. So you end up having $4 million if you need it. Generally, we settle these quickly. These are not like fine wine. They don't get better with age. So we just help the people, get them the help they need, and work to settle the claim. But the answer to the question is each church that's insured with us, each policy would provide up to $2 million to settle the claim and unlimited legal defense.
Interesting. All right, Marcia has the next question. Should parishes require a leasing document every opportunity allows an outside user?
The way I look at that is I always want to differentiate the types of use. And the way I do it is I do a test where I'm looking to see, is this outside user a legal entity? And there's a reason for that. So I'll give you an example. I have the John Smith Karate School, LLC, wants to lease space. It's an LLC. I know it's a separate legal entity. I want them to have insurance. I want to be an additional insured on that policy. And I want to really have control over what's happening when they're using my space, access, so to speak. Mm-hmm. Now, contrast that with the Quilt Club, which is 10 members of the church who informally get together in the parish hall once a month to quilt. It's not a legal entity. It's really just the church ministry. It's the church allowing ministry. You don't need a use agreement for that typically. So the answer is, if the risk decision is a funnel, the top of the funnel, first question, is this a legal entity or not? If it's a legal entity, insurance, additional insured, kick the tires, button it down. If it's not a legal entity, they're not going to have insurance. Now, that doesn't mean you just accept every entity or every situation just because it's not a legal entity. It may not be a legal entity, but the risk may be such that you don't want any piece of it. So the church maintains control over that.
Interesting. So we have two questions. One is a really interesting from Mary Ann, asking about renting space to political groups. I wonder if that relates to kind of the nonprofit status or what the relationship is.
I don't have expertise in that. That one hits me in the head that I would definitely want a lawyer to look at that because of the nature of the use. And specifically to what you're speaking of, I don't want to jeopardize my status. And if there's some, and every state can be a little different and things like that. So it's something that I would definitely want to kick the tires a little harder on that one. That's a good question.
Nancy would like to know, is there a difference in risk and corresponding mitigation strategies for groups who do not pay the parish, such as Girl Scouts, versus a group or individual renting the space?
Give me the first part of that question again.
A difference in risk and corresponding mitigation strategies.
Okay. So the risk is the same, meaning if you open it up to an outside tenant, no matter who it is, you've increased the use, which increases the risk. Now, what you're looking at with like the Girl Scouts, for example, is they've got their own coverage. Anything that happens, suit's going to go against them. It's also going to go against us. But where we want to be clear is we're not here to cover the Girl Scouts. We're here to cover the Episcopal Church. So it's important they both have their own coverage. As far as how we're going to settle the claim, depending on the situation, the circumstances of the case, we may settle it on our end and then do what's called subrogation behind the scenes later against the other entity. So for example, something terrible happens through use of a Girl Scout situation. We settle the claim. Girl Scouts is working their own angle trying to settle it. We still may go back to Girl Scouts and say, through subrogation, you owe us. And this happens a lot behind the scenes. It's transparent to the insured, but it happens quite a bit. Wherever the blame lays, their law prescribes that there's a remedy.
Interesting.
In subrogation.
And continuing on, Lori has a question about AA and NA groups who do not have outside insurance. Do you have any suggestions for this type of relationship?
No, we're well aware of it. And, you know, I always say when I meet with vestries, I say, you know, it's what I call a typical Episcopalian exposure. Every church I've ever been to, I think, has AA. So it's something we're well aware of. Now, the local AA chapter won't be able to provide.
Oh, Paul was really getting into that. Oh my goodness. I'm so sorry, everyone. Let's see if we can get Paul back. All right, let's see if we can get him back in. Oh, there we are.
All right.
All right.
Let's try it one more time. See here. I see my screen, but I don't see the show. Oh, there it is.
Yep, there we are.
All right. Sorry about that. I don't know what's wrong with the connection here today. So any other questions out there?
Oh my goodness, yes.
Great.
Okay, Betsy would like to know, could you explain more about reporting outside income as a 501c3?
I'm not a CPA. You'd have to take that to the diocese.
Diocese, yes. And I'm wondering if a church pension group might also be able to help with that.
I'm not sure if they would or not. From property and casualty, I just know that it's not in something I've got expertise with. No.
Okay.
But I would start with the diocese on something like that.
Sure. The NA and AA comments. Would you be able to just finish your question? Edie just wanted to, or sorry, finish your answer from that.
Oh, so
awareness and.
what I was trying to get, we've been down that road a million times.
Mm-hmm.
What you should know is that we're aware of that risk. It's a typical Episcopalian risk. I wouldn't spend time trying to track it down, but if we ever had a claim around AA, we would look at it, kick the tires, and if we needed to go after AA behind the scenes through subrogation, we would certainly consider that. But we haven't had any problems with it.
Okay, an interesting question from Marcia regarding the leasing question that we had a while ago. She has an example of icon painting group. So when people are not members of the parish, but they are members in the diocese, what do we do with those kind of tangled relationships?
I'm not clear what the question is.
Here, let me see if I can pull it up here. Oh, should parishes require a leasing document every opportunity it allows an outside user? So if that outside user is not part of the parish, but they are part of the diocese. Oh my. Let's see if we can get Paul back.
I'm back.
Woo!
I don't know. Let's.
Oh no.
There you are.
There we are.
Should there was a question about leasing document. That's where I lost you.
Yes, that's right. Marcia had a question about, let me just pull it up here. Should parishes require a leasing document every opportunity that allows an outside user? And then she followed up with talking about a group that was not part of the parish, but part of the diocese.
Okay. So again, you put the funnel up. Is it a legal entity? And I'm assuming the question is the answer is probably no. So then it's ministry outreach of the church, allowing their use, the space to be used. Now the other side of this is if it's sponsored by the diocese, typically we insure the diocese as well. So you shouldn't have to be getting certificates from them.
Okay.
But always go back to the question: is this a legal entity or is this just ministry of the church?
Interesting. Yes, I love that question. So Carolyn wanted us to kind of dig a little bit deeper to the kind of political group question. What are your thoughts, Paul, on using the church hall as a polling place and how that connects and kind of messes up that separation of church and state?
Lost you. Are you there?
Yeah, we're still here.
What I got, it stopped at polling place.
Oh, it's using the parish or the church hall as a polling place and
Okay.
kind of, connecting that to the larger issue of separation of church and state.
So I'm not a lawyer, so I don't know the ins and outs of that. I'd have to direct you back to the diocese. However, what I tell you,
All right, everyone. I'm going to make an executive decision here. I have access to all of your questions. I know that we haven't gotten to some of them. And I also see that we have some requests for clarification. I know, Martha, you said you were going to email Paul separately. So I think what we're going to do, instead of kind of waiting for Paul to come in and come out, I'm going to send him these questions and ask him for clarifications and for answers to them. And then I'm going to actually send that out to the group. And then we can continue that dialogue with more questions, more clarifications. But I think for everyone's patience, I want to thank you so much for all of your patience. But we can continue this conversation offline through email. And as always, just to thank everyone so much for joining us today. These are such interesting and exciting times to build these relationships, make sure that we're keeping our parishes, our people, our congregations safe, and just, building these relationships. It's so exciting to build them with outside people, with all different groups, whether it's ministry, whether it's AA, or lovely little kids in nursery schools. Thank you again. And again, my name is Adrienne Billis. Please feel free to check out episcopalfoundation.org if you have more questions about our Lilly Endowment Initiative. Also, www.ecfvp.org. Apologize. I said .com before, .org, for our webinar and more articles, more details, and please feel free to reach out. We are here. Paul Stevens is here, and we can continue this discussion offline. Paul, I want to thank you. I think with all of our technological ins and outs, we're going to carry on the conversation offline. I'm
Okay,
going to get those questions to you so that make sure we answer them and we have a
thank you.
number of clarifications. Thank you so much, Paul, for stepping in, for Steve, who's out in the field helping parishes out in California. And thank you so much, everyone, for joining us today. And I will be in touch with questions and answers and more information. So thank you again, everyone, and we'll see you soon. Thanks so much, Paul.